Welcome back to the show. Thanks for being here. Please hit like, subscribe, share, everything that you can do, even if it's a little 5-star review, writing a little something on Apple Podcasts or YouTube, giving us feedback. We appreciate it. It helps the show a lot, and I appreciate you for tuning in today because we have a special guest, Eric Gunderson, who is half of Love and Theft. Eric shares a lot about his journey, their career through Nashville, their highs, their lows, the peaks, the valleys, the meaning of it all, the hard times, and what that has produced in him. They're still making music today, and we talk a lot about his personal life, and I open up about my personal life, and we kind of just have a really cool, honest conversation. I think in today's world, sometimes we lack authenticity, and we want to just make everything perfect, and we have an imperfect conversation about being imperfect humans. And I hope you enjoy it. Here is Eric Gunderson.
This is the Stephan Hogan Podcast.
I saw Love and Theft play in Sacramento at what is now Toyota Amphitheater. Mm-hmm. And it was on the Tim McGraw tour with Lady Antebellum. Yeah. Southern Voice.
Yeah, 2010.
Yeah. Southern Voice tour.
It was called the Sleep Train Amphitheater back then, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was Sleep Train. Yeah, dude. You have a good memory. And I always got there early to watch Support, you know. And I believe you guys had a song on the radio at that point, too.
Yeah.
Which, was it Runaway?
I think it was Runaway at that point.
Yeah.
And we were a trio at that point also.
Yeah, you were a trio.
Yeah, Brian Bandus was in the band.
And I was always like, huge Eagles fan. I know you, Crosby, Stills, and Nash is your gig. And they're in my top 3 favorites of all time. Then Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, Crosby, Stills, and Nash are my top 3.
Nice.
So I feel like I'm with you on that trio vibe.
Yeah.
And it's rare. You just don't see it. But I was like, oh, man, these guys rip. And I remember buying your album on iTunes after that. And that was like my summer anthem.
That's really cool.
But I know that so much career has happened. I mean, fast forward, we're in 2025.
Yeah.
That was 15 years ago. And what went into getting you on that stage was probably a lot of years too.
Yeah.
And you've probably talked in the past about your music side, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Like in interviews and stuff like that. And people always want to go there. I'm kind of interested in where life is for you now. Because even like we were talking before of what kind of you're into and what you're doing.
Yeah.
But what is the transition like when you're on top of the mountain and then at some point, inevitably, you're like, we're not going to be here forever. Mm-hmm. Did you ever have that thought?
I've had that thought for the majority of our career, to be honest. I mean, I guess me and Stephen met in 2006, or I guess me, Stephen, and Brian met in 2006, and the whole band, like kind of the origin of it was they wanted to put together a younger group that, was influenced by the Eagles. So there were 2 producers, a guy named Robert Ellis Orrell and a guy named Jeff Copeland. Jeff's from Canada and lived in Brooklyn at the time, and he had worked on a couple projects, one being the Freaky Friday soundtrack with Lindsay Lohan. And both of them together had a song on that. And they're like, well, let's see, if we work together a little bit, like what we can come up with, what we can put together. And like me, Brian, and Stephen were all in town here in Nashville. We'd all been here for maybe a year and a half, maybe less for Brian and Stephen. And we're all doing our solo careers. And I was in a duo kind of part-time with my roommate. We were, out gigging and playing shows. And basically I auditioned to be in this band, and
so it was almost like a boy band audition
in a way. Like,
interesting.
Like at that point, I guess there was a lot of production teams that were kind of trying to put things together to see what would work and
to pitch to labels.
I
didn't know that.
And they had been approached by a guy named David Gray, not the artist, but A&R guy at Sony in New York, and I guess it was Daylight Records. They had like the Jonas Brothers at the time, and Good Charlotte, and a couple others, and they were looking to kind of break into the country scene and do something that was more on like the pop rock, but Eagles, Crosby, Stills, and Nash influenced vibe. And So we got together, started writing some songs, and realized that, we sounded good together. We liked playing together. And went up there to New York, showcased in front of their label team, and realized that his hands were kind of tied. He could only sign a couple things a year, and he had already signed 2 acts that year. So we were going to have to wait till the following year to try to get a deal there. And then we decided just to take that project and go around Nashville and pitch it to people. And, at that point, the business was completely different than it is now. iTunes wasn't a thing yet. We had heard about this new thing that would be coming out. It would be $1 a download, and they swore up and down that it was going to help things. And, the dinosaurs in the business were like, no, we can't go for this. It's going to ruin the business. And at the time, it seemed okay for us. We were young, we were new, so we thought the new kind of move to the more digital side of things was, going to work, and obviously it has. So we tried to embrace it as much at that point as possible. But even for like those first kind of 8 years of our career, like there was still a process. There was still a machine that you kind of were put into and, churned out hits. That was kind of the way the business worked. And, to answer your question, like what it feels like to kind of be on that mountaintop and come down, like we thought that in order to be successful in the business, you had to have a hit song, and then you had to have another hit song, and you had to keep following it up, keep feeding the beast. And at the beginning of our career, it did happen that way in a sense. But we were on Lyric Street Records for our first project, and we're signed by Doug Howard and Randy Goodman, and it was really incredible. It had this incredible family type feel. The label was owned by Disney, so there was a lot of restrictions as far as our image, what we could say, what we could sing about. And, looking back on it, I think that was a good thing, but also kind of, I wouldn't say stifled the creativity, but I don't think you could necessarily be as honest back then as you wanted to be, because we had, 50 people looking over our shoulders saying, I don't know if that's the right direction for the next single. That sounds a little bit too edgy, doesn't really fit the Disney image.
Did you feel like you knew who you were as a person just at that time?
I think I felt like I thought I knew who I was as a person. And I think when you're in your early 20s like that, everybody thinks they know who they are and they know what their path is and their purpose. And what I've realized as I've gotten older is I had no clue. And I still don't really have a clue. And I think that's kind of the beauty of maturing and growing up, is you learn how much you don't know. And there's so many people that aren't willing to say, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I approached this in a completely wrong way. Instead, I think a lot of artists in particular blame everyone else. And it's an easy thing to do because you're a victim of circumstance. Well, the label shut down, the marketing team dropped the ball. Oh, they bought another label in the middle of our project, and we lost all the focus that was on us. Or they waited 10 weeks to put out a single off the heels of a #1 record. None of it made sense. But, it's easy in that moment to blame it on everyone else, but we probably should have looked in the mirror and said, well, maybe we're doing this wrong. Maybe we're too passionate about this, and we need to be more passionate about this. Maybe our eggs are in the wrong basket. And I don't think you necessarily know in the moment, like, what's right, what's wrong, what's up, what's down. But I think that's the beauty of being in a business for 15, 20 years, is you can look back on the whole trajectory of your career and say, it was meant to happen this way. And I wouldn't be in the position that I am now had it not happened this way. And I think it's easy to pass blame, and, you see, artists that don't necessarily pay their dues in the sense that we had to, just because the business is completely different.
Very
you see
different.
them shoot to the top, but they don't always have a lot of staying power. And I think for us,
you had staying power.
I'd like to think so.
You did. I'd like to say that you did.
Well, thank you. Well, that's refreshing and cool to hear.
I feel like Love and Theft was a staple on country radio for quite a while. When you would have like the one-hit wonders still,
right.
But not everybody had that, and so, and it wasn't like it was always like smash after smash after smash, but it was like at least in the market I grew up in, Sacramento, like you were being spun on country radio regularly.
And Sacramento, Northern California, like that was one of our better markets in the country. I mean, they were huge in helping us get our first #1, our first top 5. Like they were always big supporters of us. And we have like those pockets around the country, you know, it shrinks on certain years and grows in others. And I don't think there's any real rhyme or reason. But I think one thing we've tried to do as a band is stay consistent. And, you know, we have a lot of friends that are in the business that have, you know, come up, shot to the top, and then kind of found their identity or what they thought their identity was and kind of shifted to, you know, play more to that. And I think a lot of times they weren't necessarily finding their identity. They were chasing a fad or chasing what was working on the radio at that point. And they said, oh, all of a sudden, this is me. This is who I am. And it, you know, conveniently coincided with, you know, the trends in the business and, you know, stuff that sounds good on the radio and stuff that's popular. And, you know, a lot of them were copying other artists, trying to chase what was successful at the time. And I think Stephen and I sat down pretty early on in our career and just said, hey, we're going to be true to ourselves and we're going to be true to our influences and, you know, what's gotten us to where we're at. And obviously the production and the vibe changes from record to record, but I think we've always tried to stay true to, you know, where we're at any given moment and not try to pretend that we're something that we're not just to chase a fad on the radio and even in playing the social media game. I mean, at the beginning of our career, that was such a small part of it. Now it's everything. Yeah. And, you know, the old school model still exists, I think, but it doesn't exist in the same fashion that it used to. And I think there's room for that. And there's, you know, obviously sign a major label deal. Obviously now you have to give up a whole lot. And even the 360 deals, I'm like, holy cow, like, what does the artist have left? And looking back at our deals, I'm like, well, we didn't have anything either. Like, you work so hard to make a record, make a project, and then you have sometimes less than 10% of it, and you don't have really any say or control over what they do with it or where your music is placed. So I guess, you know, at this point in our career, to have that independence is a blessing, but then at the same time, if you don't have a ton of money to push it and to market it, having 100% of nothing is nothing. So, you know, I think there's something to be said for, you know, the way these labels are doing it now. There's a lot of people that are signing to smaller boutique labels and then doing singles and label services deals with bigger labels, you know, on the promotion side. Yeah. And I think it requires being creative to make it work.
Yeah. Right? Back to your pinnacle, though, what I'm curious about is if you could pinpoint a moment where you would say this was the pinnacle. It could have been on stage at a show, in an arena. I don't know. Was there a point in where you were like, wow?
I would say when Angel Eyes went number one, we were on tour with Brad Paisley, and we were playing on like the Opry Next stage. They kind of do that now, where they send out like a mobile stage on some of these big tours. But that one in particular, we were out there with Jenna Kramer. Who else was on there? Kristen Kelly. A couple artists that were on Sony, and then a couple new female artists. And I remember we got done with the show with Brad, and we were playing an after party in Buffalo, New York. And there was like, we thought maybe we would find out that night if it had gone number one or not. And a couple radio guys called us that were friends that were still on the radio side, and were like, hey, we got some extra spins in for you. I think you're going to get it. And I remember that night, everybody that was on the tour showed up to Buffalo, and we were on stage in the middle of it, and like people were running up, like giving us thumbs up and stuff, saying, hey, it did it. You got your first number one. And I think, I don't know, I just have this very vivid memory of being on stage and like having this like very like peaceful feeling, like, man, we did it. Like, this is the pinnacle. You get a number one on country radio. Like, that's every artist's dream. And then that quickly shifted to like anxiety, because I was thinking, well, we have to follow this up with something else that does the same thing. And like up until that point, we looked at a lot of our peers and people that, you know, kind of were in the business and came into it at the same time as us. I mean, Lady Antebellum is a good example. We had the same attorney. She was working on both of our record deals at the same time. I think theirs got done a year and a half earlier than ours did. So they had music that came out sooner, you know, and we watched them, and they had their first number one, and they hadn't followed up with another one, and they had another big hit. And, you know, it seemed like to be successful as an artist, you had to be able to follow it up with something else. So we had our first song, Runaway, label shut down, and then we moved over to Sony. Brian decided that he wanted to quit, so we became a duo, released our first song as a duo, and that one thankfully did go to number one. So I kind of felt
so
like
that was Angel Eyes.
Yeah, and I felt like we were kind of riding that wave still from Runaway, and we had made incredible relationships at country radio, which at that point was everything. If you didn't have relationships with country radio, you were dead in the water. So, we did a 160 station radio tour where you go to every single station and have dinner with every program director.
Did you like that? Like, I feel like you're a people person, and I don't know if you're an extroverted introvert or an introverted extrovert.
Yeah.
But you seem like you are great with people at being kind to people. How would you say that you felt at those dinners?
Yeah.
And was that something that was a breeze for you, or was it stressful?
Me and Stephen were actually talking about this the other day, and because oftentimes we'll be talking and be like, well, yeah, country radio picked us to be on one of the new faces in that year, and CRS playing the New Faces show, that's another big kind of, benchmark or kind of notch on your belt sort of thing. Like, okay, if you're on that show, usually good things are going to happen, and you have the support of the majority of the country radio community. And I think, I don't know, at first we were so excited just to be out there and to be doing it that every one of those dinners felt like, okay, these are real relationships. These are, these people like us as much as we like them. And then I quickly realized it's very much a formality. Like, we formed some incredible friendships with a lot of different people at radio, but they're also having that same dinner with 4 or 5 different artists a week. And, you're going in there, you're spending thousands of dollars on a dinner, maybe giving them a free show.
Of your own money.
Of your own money.
Yep.
It's recoupable, through the record deal. And then we've also done it on the independent side where it comes straight out of your pocket. And you get promised ads, you get promised airplay, and then 6 weeks later they haven't spun the record yet. They haven't even thought about adding it, and like, oh, my hands are tied. And there's a consultant that picks our playlist. And fast forward 15 years, now there's really, there's only about, I guess, 60, maybe 70 stations that you even need to go to. I've heard it's really closer to like 25 because all of these stations are programmed basically by a certain playlist that's basically picked by consultants.
They're conglomerates.
Yeah. So that even that side of it has changed. So as far as those meetings go, and I'd say Steve and I are both people. We both grew up in church. My dad was a music minister, worship leader. Stephen's dad was a pastor of a church. My grandfather was a pastor. So I think we grew up knowing how to talk to people, like having parents that were in leadership positions in big churches. It was kind of, you were expected to be kind of a reflection of your parents. And, if you couldn't hold a good conversation, if you couldn't kind of hold your own in a social atmosphere, that was almost frowned upon. So I felt like I had media training almost as a kid in the church growing up. I did all the music in our youth group and at my school, I did all the stuff for chapel and everything. So I was always around and in front of people. So it was easier, I guess, for me to have those kind of conversations. So once we got into the radio tour side of it, we were having these conversations. I think we were both fairly engaging, and I think people on the radio side recognize that. And I think that did help strengthen those relationships. But back to what I was saying before, it's like I think there's a lot of there's just a lot of fakeness. I mean, it's like you recognize it for what it is. It's payola in a sense. It's like, okay, take me to a nice dinner, buy me a nice bottle of wine, buy me a couple to take home to my wife. And, back then people were getting flat screen TVs, delivered to them. They were going on vacations, and, the label was covering the bill. So,
yeah.
I mean,
I talked to Craig Campbell about that, and it was the exact same thing for him.
Yep.
Like, we promise you spins.
Yep.
Will you come play this free show? He's like in a blind hunting. Gets on a plane. They provide a guitar. We'll play your song, trying to get it up.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't.
Yep.
iPads, whatever it is. And it's interesting. Will you talk about payola for people listening that don't know what that is?
Yeah, I guess payola, when you hear about it in the old school sense, in the Motown world, and back in the early pop days, it was a lot of these record executives, did a lot of blow, did a lot of other stuff, wanted nice things, nice cars, but couldn't get away with someone just directly buying it for them, or spending labels' money to have this stuff. So these promo people and stuff would figure out what it was that this guy needed, and they would provide him with that more or less in order to get something out of it.
Yeah,
to
they were exchanging money for airtime, essentially.
Yeah, basically.
And that got it got outlawed,
right?
And then it just turned into you having fancy dinners and all of that.
Yeah, and so
it's the same exact thing. It still happens today,
and it happens in every business, really.
It's the schmoozing.
Yeah.
It's the schmoozing. And you're right, because music business is a business just like any other vertical.
Yep.
Where there's the relational side. I like to think there's businesses where you don't have to bribe someone through things to get something.
Yeah.
But they just do it because they care. And I'm sure you probably had experiences where there were program directors that legit believed in you.
100%. And those guys are still out there. And again, like I say, every business has their form of payola. Like, you have good, moral, ethical people in every business that want to do things the right way and keep things as above board as possible. But then there's also people that are, fairly pragmatic, and they look at it and they say, oh, well, if I give this guy this, he's obviously in a tight spot financially. I can get what I want out of it. I can make him happy, and,
Yeah. Do you think Nashville is a kind of a quid pro quo city, like I'll do something for you, you do something for me city, and that's how it operates?
I think so.
Like right now.
I think right now, and I think it really always has been. There's very few people that really want to help you just to help you. There are people out there that are passionate about music, about film, about photography, about the marketing side of things, that will do it just because they love the business so much and they love their craft and they've worked at it for 15, 20 years. And I think people also go through different phases where they're willing to do things for free or on spec just because they need the opportunity and they need their work to be exposed and get out there like that. But I think there's also people that get burnt and get very jaded and bitter very quickly, and then they turn into the type of guys where it's all about the money and it's no longer about the craft. It's no longer about the creative process. It's no longer about the music. It's about, all right, well, I did this for you. What can you do for me? Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I feel like the town now more than ever, Nashville seems, I think, clickier than it ever has been, especially like on the songwriting and the production side of things. Like, a lot of these artists kind of have their little circle that they come up with. And it existed back when we were coming up in the business also, but it was also different because, like, if we had a record deal and the friends that had come up around us didn't, like, we didn't really have the ability or the leash really to, bring the artists that we wanted to bring on tour or, collaborate with, an artist that we were friends with. If they weren't on the same label and there wasn't the right synergy there, they almost didn't allow it to happen. And I think there's more freedom now, since people aren't necessarily tied down to these traditional record deals, to do that. And I think, you mentioned Morgan Wallen earlier, like his camp, his crew, the people that are writing for him, like, it seems like they keep things, pretty close. And again, I'm not necessarily in a lot of the current circles, so I don't.
Yeah, it seems like
exactly
if you were with Sony, you would have a Sony artist writing with the Sony publishing side. Because at the end of the day, Sony wants to make as much money as they can off of that. So they kind of keep a closed circle around. It's like a corral around anything that has to do with anybody they have.
And I think that's good. I think it, like, in the sense, like, say, let's just use Morgan, for example. Like, he's got a very particular sound and the production has a very particular vibe. And I think if you break outside of that little circle, that immediately would change, and that you run the risk of it not being as successful or not as consumable because people have grown accustomed to the product that he puts out. So if he switches it up and does something crazy different, then that could lose a lot of fans, affect the bottom line. There's a lot of reasons and strategy, I guess, that goes into it.
When did you find yourself going from the peak, finding that number one on stage for Angel Eyes, to what was the valley of the shadow of death?
Yeah.
And how long did it take to get there?
I think, like, with the mentality like that I kind of came into the business with, it was like, if you didn't have a record deal, your career was over at the time. And so we went from Lyric Street to Sony, and at that point it felt like an upgrade. Like, we were on the same label as Miranda, Carrie Underwood, Brooks and Dunn, Montgomery Gentry at the time, and some of the duos had moved off of that label, so we felt like there was a room for us to kind of be the new duo that kind of came out and did some stuff, and that was awesome. But at the same time, like you were talking about, that synergy that is usually there when you're on a label. Like it wasn't like you looked at like Miranda Lambert and Chris Young, like they had, they were out on tour together. There were some collaborations and stuff. Like we were hoping that maybe some of those would materialize for us, with other Sony artists. And it was in a weird transitionary kind of period in the business where like even people that were on the same label, like they were they kept their cards close to the vest. They didn't really want to branch out, because if you were on the same label, you were a direct competition. And in order to, we were all fighting to try to get singles out on the radio at that point. And it's like if you were to do a collaboration with another artist on the label, well, maybe that would delay my single from coming out as a solo artist. Like, I don't know. There's just some weird stuff that kind of happened that we had, had in the works, and then it was squashed for whatever reason. So I think as we moved through the process on that label, and we had our first song come out there, which was Angel Eyes, and we put out a song called Running Out of Air afterwards, and that was one where they waited, I think it was almost 2.5 months before they put out the follow-up single, and we're sitting there kind of twiddling our thumbs like, hey man, we're losing all of the momentum here. And the chairman of that label at the time was Gary Overton, and he'd actually signed us at EMI as publisher or as songwriters, and he was a publisher back then. And we thought, hey, this is great. We have this guy that's a champion for us. He's in our corner coming over here. He's going to make some things happen. It was almost like he tried, or maybe he was forced to kind of play more of the political game, and he had signed 3 or 4 solo female artists, and for whatever reason, he was like, we have to get these songs out before we release your next single. And better or worse, I mean, it kind of felt like it took the wind out of our sails completely, and we lost a lot of that momentum. So I'd say that was kind of like my first kind of feeling of like coming down from that mountaintop experience. Like, okay, we've hit this goal, and this was the goal. We had to get here in order to really make this work for the rest of our career, but then we have to follow it up with something else so we're not one-hit wonders. And we didn't necessarily feel that pressure at the time, I think, because we had already had a hit with Runaway. And again, we had the support of our peers in the business. We had a lot of support from radio. The label seemed to be completely behind it. But then, that Run Out of Air peaked in the 20s, and it was just an absolute battle to get that even to chart and then get it into the top 40. And then for whatever reason, we got a lot of feedback, which I think was just because it had taken so much time, but people were looking for excuses not to play it at that point. Like, oh, it sounds a little bit too pop, doesn't sound like anything else that's on the radio. And that was kind of our goal. We wanted to put something out that, piqued people's interest, that when they heard it on the radio, they were like, who is that? That's a little bit different. And so,
As it should be. That's called creativity.
That's what we thought.
That's being an artist.
They're like, oh, you guys are just ahead of your time. And then 2 years later, you see Thomas Rhett coming out and releasing literally sonically and like track-wise a song that was exactly the same as that. And, it was played. It was #1. It was huge. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is way more pop than anything we were putting out. It was almost like they were always looking for an excuse not to play something. And I think that was kind of my first real realization that, okay, these relationships don't matter as much as I thought they did. I mean, you have to have them in order to have the success, but then also the music speaks for itself a lot of the time. And it really comes down to what the label wants to push and what they want to spend the money on. And there was a few new shiny toys kind of in the arsenal, and they were going to try those out first. And so that song peaked in the 20s, and we put out another one, peaked in the 20s. Then we started recording music for a new record over there. They put that song out, and again, peaked in the 20s, which, we'd fought to have a lot of songs even break into the top 40, which was huge.
Yeah, 20s is
So to
good.
have songs in the 20s is good, but when you're on a major label like that, if you're not having top 5s, at least top 10s, you're considered a failure. So, I think that's when I kind of started realizing, like, okay, things aren't going to just be smooth sailing like we kind of had hoped for. And we thought, hey, at least if we get this #1, we'll get 5-6 years out of that. And now looking back on it, we've gotten 15-ish years out of it, or 12 now since then. But at the time, you think, if I'm not having this hitting benchmark after benchmark, then I'm not successful.
So you felt, not to speak for you, but it seems like is failure after failure.
Yeah. And I think looking back on it now, like, you have to fail to appreciate the success. And I think your failures kind of define what success is, in a sense. I mean, if I had just had songs come out and just had nothing but hits, like, you don't really, I don't know if you appreciate it the same way. And I don't think, looking back on it, I would trade anything career-wise for something different. You know, I mean, I think the way that things have happened for us is the way that they were meant to happen. And maybe if we had had 5 number ones out of the gate, like, we would have been horrible stewards of that success and that money. I mean, I think a lot of times, I mean, you have really good years, you have bad years, and you have years where you're chasing it just to make ends meet financially. And then you have other years where you're truly passionate about the music and creating a product that you don't really care what people think about it. You just want to, you know, release kind of your creative expression and express yourself through music in the way that you want to. And I think sometimes the most authentic, real projects come out of those moments. And I think the ones where you're really trying to chase success for the financial gain, I think people see right through that. And I think looking back on our career, it's like, I'm grateful for and I welcome the failures, because I think that is what makes me appreciate the success that we've had. And I think having a more grateful, thankful mindset facilitates authentic creativity. And I think, like you said, that's something that's so hard to find these days. And I think as artists, and then I think in particular, like record labels and marketing companies, like, I don't think they give the listener the credit that they deserve, because our listeners are very, very intelligent people. I'm not saying all of them are, but the consumer knows what they want. And I think a lot of times these labels and these big companies try to force feed people what they think that they want. And they even go so far as telling them that this is what they want. And I think people are just smarter than that. And they know when something is authentic and they know when it's not. I mean, I've been really listening to Stephen Wilson Jr.'s newest album, and it is one of the most raw, incredible records that I think I've ever heard. And it's authentic, it's real, and I don't think the guy gives 2 shits what anyone really thinks about it. And I have no idea what his politics are. I have no idea anything about the guy.
Yeah.
I just know that I love his music and it speaks to me. And I think when I listen to music, that's what I want to hear. I want to hear authenticity. And I don't. I mean, sure, sometimes I'll listen to whatever's on top 40 radio for a few weeks at a time, and then I'll, you know, go in my hole and listen to stuff that no one's heard of. And I think
I feel like, not to interrupt you, but on that vein, I think it's important that you say that, because you have like the Sturgills of the world that seem like they're really just being true to the craft.
Yeah.
Or like Tyler Childers. And now his career is almost on a revival.
Yeah.
Because of Zach Bryan.
Right.
And then you have those, or Jason Isbell. I always get his last name screwed up, but I said it right, correct?
I think so. Isbell.
And then his career got revived because Morgan Wallen covered one of his songs. So you have like these artists that really just said, you know, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. And then, in a sense, it seems like the mainstream machine ends up grabbing the authenticity factor from them, using it, capitalizes on it, and then it almost grows their career.
For sure.
Which is weird.
It is. It's backwards. But
it's backwards, but it's still like they stuck to their guns versus wrote for what they thought versus the idea of the Rick Rubin concept, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Rick Rubin a brilliant producer. And like a lot of people that have listened to his interviews are like, wait a second, this guy doesn't really know much about music? Well, I think he knows a shit ton about music. He's not necessarily the most musical person, but I think that's what allows – he basically takes people's creativity and allows it to kind of flourish. And I guess he, in a way, picks out the brilliant parts that maybe they don't even see. Or maybe a lot of times as a producer, he's in the room and he doesn't have to do a whole lot of anything, just because he's picked the right artist to work with. But then also I think he pulls things out of people that, you know, they can't pull that out of themselves. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And I love listening to the interviews with him just because it gives, for me as a musical person, like I feel like I get hyper fixated on parts and, you know, creating a sonic masterpiece. And I tend to, you know, tinker and mess with things, and I do that to a fault. And I take something that really was at a great place creatively, and I kind of overthink it into something that's not as good. So having people out there like a Rick Rubin, like, I think it helps me to realize, like, hey, not everything has to be perfect. Yeah. There's beauty in imperfection. And I think that's a lot of times needs to be fostered and cultivated in a way that, you know, allows the artist to get out of their own head and just be a creative genius.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes another creative genius in a different way to bring that out of people.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because you mentioned the imperfection, and one of my top 2 favorite songs of all time is Helplessly Hoping by Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Yeah. And on the intro to that song, there's a flub, like a guitar flub. Mm-hmm. It's like a muted string that he hits on the way up to a C chord, I think. And I love that.
Yeah.
Because of the humanity.
Yep.
And I think that we listen to old records, or at least I like vinyl and stuff like that, and you hear that it wasn't perfect and they weren't playing to a metronome and the songs breathe, and there was like, you're like, oh, that was a little off or whatever it may be, but it was human. It had the more human aspect, and it's really hard in the industry, and I would like you to speak into this, where perfect is expected.
Yeah. Yeah, I think perfection in the performance, perfection in the recorded music, I think, you know, like you said, it's expected, and if it isn't perfect, it's blamed on budget, or it's blamed, the artist is blamed for, you know, not being able to sing without autotune and this, that, and the other. And, you know, Nashville's a weird place. You have these studio musicians that are all part of a union that are probably the best musicians in the world. I mean, I know guys that have moved here from New York, from LA, from Israel, from England, from Paris, from all over the world, just because of the studios that we have here and the players that are here. And, you know, a lot of times you go into these sessions and you have these A-list players that literally could give you a flawless, perfect performance in their sleep. And at a certain point, I don't know if it's that we've done a disservice to the music, or I don't know, I guess it really depends on the listener more than anything, but I feel like we've given these guys the reins. And even as a producer, it's like when I'm deciding who I want to hire to, you know, play drums or play bass on a record that I'm producing or working on, or even if it's for Stephen and I, like, you kind of go through the list and you're like, all right, this guy does this really well. This guy has that more kind of old school, looser feel on the drums. So you pick your player based off of, let's say that, and then you get with an engineer or somebody you can get in the studio, and it's like, all right, let's take those drums and quantize them and make everything pocketed and make it sound perfect. I'm like, well, wait, the whole purpose was to get this raw feeling. Or, you know, you record something to tape and then you just dump it right back into Pro Tools. I'm like, well, what was the point of that anyway? We just wasted our time just to scratch somebody's, you know, itch, you know, because their ego tells them, oh, we have to record this to tape because that's the way they did it, you know, in the 60s.
Yeah.
Like, well, it's not the 60s anymore. But, I mean, there's something to be said for just letting it be and letting it be awesome. And I think we just overthink, we overproduce, we over-engineer, we over-edit, and all to try to make it sound perfect, because what you hear on the radio 9 times out of 10 sounds perfect. And if you want it to be competitive, the labels are always going to be looking for an excuse for why something didn't work. If it works and it's successful, they take all the credit. If it doesn't work, it's 100% the artist's fault. So it's like you're kind of in this catch-22 where, okay, if I can't give them any reason not to play this, so I need it to be perfect. I need it to have these 3 A-list players on it because that guy's been on the last, you know, 4 number 1 records in a row, and, you know, he won Grammy, you know, Guitar Player of the Year, and that song won a Grammy. So it's like you're trying to chase this perfect thing that's already happened on the radio, and then that gets back to what I was talking about earlier, where we're chasing fads and we're chasing sounds in order to stay relevant and stay competitive, but then everything starts to sound the same. And, you know, even listening to the radio right now, I can pick out the sample pack that they have pulled like the snare sound from on probably 6 or 7 different records. And it's like, I know that whether it was Near or Shannon Forrest or Chris McHugh, Nick Buda, or any of them, I know that that's not their snare sound. That's like, and you have these guys like player wise that, you know, spend hours and hours and hours, you know, getting the perfect drum, getting the perfect head, like miking it perfectly. And then we just go back and replace it anyway. It's like all in the name of perfection. And I think we take away kind of, like you said, the humanity and the rawness and the realness and the authenticity there. And I don't know, I guess that's just a long-winded way of saying
well,
what you
now
already said.
Take that idea and apply it to not even music.
Yeah.
Apply it to just being a person now in a world where all we see all day long is perfection.
Yeah.
Like you go on any social media, you see the best of everything, of everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a highlight reel, right?
Yeah, it's a highlight reel, and everything. Everybody's focusing on perfect, and it's interesting that you say you feel the need in that, but I don't even think it's just quantified to music. I think it is a universal pressure that's put on society, is put on men, it's put on women. Mm-hmm. I heard that the body dysmorphia rate for men's climbing, and that within a decade it'll be, if it's at the current growth rate, higher than where women are currently. Yeah. And so all we see is perfect all day long, and perfect doesn't exist. But I think there's going to be a almost adjustment, if you will, in the market of perfection. Mm-hmm. And I think it's actually starting to happen, and we're on the heels of people looking for something that isn't perfect. Yeah. Do you feel that way?
I feel like that. I mean, completely. I mean, I was talking to my wife the other day about it, and she was like, hey, why don't you post more? Like, I mean, we were on a USO type trip over to Poland during the holidays this year. We went over there for like almost 3 weeks and played like 10 shows on different military bases and
You've
stuff.
done a lot with the troops, right?
Yeah. It's
really
something
cool.
We're really passionate about, and working with veterans here in the States, and then obviously going over there to play and perform for active duty troops that, you know, a lot of them have been stationed over there for 7 to 9 months, haven't seen their family. So the least we could do was, you know, go take our Christmas and New Year's and play for them. So it was really,
I got to acknowledge you for that.
Well, thank you.
That's really amazing.
It's something that, you know, I've always been super passionate about. Majority of my family's military, and, you know, I don't think people realize how many sacrifices those guys really make. I mean, a lot of bases are nice and hard structures and stuff, but in Poland it's all tents and forward operating bases out in the middle of the woods. It was literally like something out of World War II. It was kind of crazy to see, but you know, it was a cool experience because we've done bases all over the world, but like mainly in the Middle East and Asia, and those are all very established bases that have been there for forever, and we've got beautiful hard structures, basically cities inside of cities.
Oh, yeah.
And this was not that way at all. So it was cool to see a different side of it and see that these dudes are literally out there for 9 months, freezing cold, sleeping in tents. And
so why didn't you take pictures?
Well, during that trip, I took a lot more pictures than I normally would and posted a lot more on social media. Just, I don't know, it just felt like it was easier to do in that moment. And I think, and back to what I was talking to my wife about, she was like, well, why don't you post more? And kind of to echo your point, it's like, well, I want to make sure the cameras are perfect. I want to make sure the lighting's right. I want to make sure it looks good. So the product that I'm putting out there is as consumable as possible. Because even for me personally, like when I'm looking on social media at stuff, especially on like the music and sports entertainment side of things, like I personally I gravitate towards the more raw stuff, like the iPhone videos, the stuff that isn't as polished. But for whatever reason, I feel like I've kind of had it pounded into my head by these labels, by these, you know, big marketing companies. Like, well, no, whatever you put out has to be, you know, top-notch, premium content that, you know, has some production value to it, and just always going to stand out from the other stuff. Yet, I look at what my kids are watching on YouTube, on Instagram, on YouTube Shorts and stuff, and it's very much the viral, cell phone recorded, simple stuff. And then I look at, you know, the artists that are having the most success on social media, and it seems like the ones that just allow kind of unfettered access into their personal lives, and they don't really keep their personal private lives separate from, you know, the entertainer side of them. And I think growing up, like I have a theory, like why I kind of am stuck in this rut. And like growing up listening to the Eagles, listening to Tom Petty, even Johnny Cash, like there was something that was incredibly mysterious about all of those artists, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a ton of access. There wasn't, I don't know, it's almost like you listen to the music to get a deeper look into their lives and their psyche and like why they write the way they do, why they perform the way they do. And I don't know, I think there's something to be said for like the mystery that doesn't really exist anymore. And I think maybe I'm a purist in the sense that I would like to maintain some of that mystery and that, I don't know, you look at it, like why are people obsessed with celebrities? I think it's because they want to know what has made them as successful as they are. At least that's how I approach it. I know some people are just obsessed with celebrity and they're obsessed with that and what comes with it. So they just, let's use Taylor Swift as an example. I mean, she has these diehard Swiftie fans that literally would do whatever she says. And like, but I don't know, that's a different generation. Like, I feel like when I talked to my dad about why he liked the music that he liked, and like, there's never any mention of, I really like the Eagles, but like I didn't really like their politics. Like we're in like this weird place in this day and age, like where people actually go look up someone's political affiliation before they'll even listen to the music. And not to get political, but I think like that's like we're in such a divided place as a nation, as a world politically, to where we've taken like, I don't know, I guess the way people look at politics and they look at a politician or they look at someone that's hosting a podcast and they want to figure out, okay, what do they believe? What are their religious affiliations? And that helps shape whether they're a fan of this individual or not. And I would love it to get back to the place where politics, religion, all of that doesn't matter anymore. And it becomes all about the music and there can be like that mystery there where like no one needs to know if I'm Republican or Democrat, but they love the music because the music's good and it sparks something. It connects. It does something for them and mainly I think it's on a spiritual level because I think, if you get into the science of, frequencies and like what our ears do and how they work with the brain and stuff, it's like music can be healing. I mean, music makes you feel things, and I think the humanity has been taken out of music so much. It's so computerized. It's not really raw. It's not really authentic. And I think that's why like the Zach Bryans of the world are working because it's not a super polished sounding record. I mean, a lot of them sound like glorified demos and people have absolutely latched onto it because I think it's authentic and he doesn't give a fuck what anyone really thinks about him. And he just does what he does and people love him and he doesn't need the machine to move his career forward. And I think we'll see a lot of kind of copycat people that are trying to just release bad demos and stuff to be like that. But that's not going to be considered authentic in my opinion because now you're chasing something. So I think there's room for a few people to kind of do it each time. And I think the business is very cyclical and I think trends come back around. I mean, especially right now, even in the country world, listening to all the sounds from like the 70s and 80s synthesizers and stuff, which I love and I think are amazing. It's like there's just like, the 80s, let's dump that back into this. And, there's some people that do it really well and there's some people that don't do it very well.
Yeah, there's a nostalgia factor in music.
And I think that's the best word for it.
I would be interested in hearing you and Stephan sit down in a room across from each other with 2 guitars and 2 mics and doing live stuff.
Yeah.
And like cutting it into a record and maybe doing a little bit of overdubbing. Yeah. But just feeling off of each other without a click. Because you guys have so many hours logged singing together that it's almost like you don't even have to think about it,
Yeah, and that's the beauty of like growing up in church and singing with our families and siblings and stuff, like learning to sing harmonies in church. Like, I don't know, growing up singing with family, it's like you just, like it's a privilege, I think. And it's like, you'll never really find anyone else that you blend with as well as a family member just because of this, tonal qualities of your voices and stuff. So I think when Stephan and I do sing together, we feel incredibly blessed and fortunate because we almost sound like brothers. And even people ask us, like, are you guys related? Like your voices blend really, really well together. So I think there's something to be said for, playing with each other for 19 years now. Like it does just kind of come naturally.
Oh, yeah.
just even like a
I was so
new song when
impressed.
we're working it out, it's like the harmonies just kind of happen. And
Dude, when I saw you at Exit In, and got to hear it, and it's usually like you look at like a FGL or a Dan and Shay, there's one lead singer,
Right.
you know, but both of your vocals were hot, and it's
Thank you.
rare to hear, you know, and it's like the harmonies are so on point because of your blend. That was something I was really impressed with, that the contribution was equal in terms of the vocal performance,
Yeah.
which I feel like you don't see or hear anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing, like even when we would kind of like pitch ourselves to other labels and stuff after Sony closed. I mean, and we've had a few other deals since then that have been great, and a couple that haven't, but that was kind of our pitch, was like, no, we're a real duo. Like, we both actually sing lead. It's not like just a lead singer and then a guitar player who sings some harmonies. And I think that's something, even when there was 3 of us, and actually originally there was 4 of us, and like the whole goal was just to find 4 voices that really blended together and had that kind of family blend, or I guess the closest thing we could compare it to was the Eagles and that amazing 4-part harmony. So,
Oh, yeah. And we haven't had, you know, like you guys were, that's why I bought your CD. I think iTunes was a thing by then.
Yeah, it was.
And it was because of those harmonies.
That's awesome.
And that's what I was hungry for. But
And
no one
even
was
still,
doing
that's
it.
like what Steve and I are most passionate about. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter really what type of vibe the track is or the production of a certain project. Like, we've always kind of maintained at least some, I don't know, congruence or cohesiveness through the records and stuff by kind of using a similar vocal treatment and really focusing on the vocals as opposed to the production. Like, a lot of times I think, especially these modern records, the production gets in the way, especially if you have a track guy that literally is building a track with no vocal. It's like, okay, well, let's fill it out and put something everywhere. And now all of a sudden there's no room for the vocal, and you get a very linear, dry vocal performance just because there's not a whole lot of room to put stuff in there. So
Yeah. Versus what can we take away?
Exactly.
Which it should be the thought process.
Yeah.
in
And
my
like, even
opinion.
working with Josh Leo on a couple records, our self-titled one, and then the one we did after that for Curb Records, or actually before that we did an acoustic record, and that was the one that had Whiskey on My Breath on it. And even throughout that process, is like, my tendency in that portion of our career was like, okay, I want to prove myself as a producer. And I thought the way to do that was just to get as many guitar parts or as many key parts on something as I possibly could, and then figure out a way to blend it all together and make it sound super full and, you know, meaty. And a lot of times I think that took away from the vocal performance, like I was saying. So it was cool to learn from Josh, and we'd literally sit there in front of the console and start with pretty much nothing, and then slowly add things back in with the vocal already there,
where you could pull
to where we could pull
out.
things out.
Yeah.
And I remember looking down at the console and saying to myself, well, there's nothing there. Where did everything go? And he's like, just trust me. And as we slowly just put stuff back in, he was like, this is how I think it should sound. I'm like, well, what if we had that? That's a really cool part. That's a really cool part. Now, so-and-so played that. We need to have that on there. And it was almost like I was playing like a political game there in the recording studio, trying to, you know, scratch this player's back and make sure that he had a featured spot on the track when
I
it didn't
get
necessarily
that,
call
man.
for it. It didn't need it. In fact, it was probably distracting. And Josh was a really, really good mentor in the sense that he taught me that less is more. And, you know, sometimes less isn't enough. And, you know, depending on the project, depending on the artist, like, you know, different things need more and different things need less. But I think...
Yeah, let's talk about that record, because Whiskey on My Breath was in my opinion, it was a huge song.
Yeah.
Did it go number 1?
It didn't. I think it peaked. I think it went number 1 on like the highway, or maybe even top 5 on the highway. And then we actually went on Bobby Bones' morning show while that song was out, and we were completely independent at the time. Went on there, and he kind of gave the song completely new life. It had done well around town for us, and like when people heard it on the highway, they just assumed it was getting played on the radio as well, because I've noticed a lot of people, like if you listen to XM radio or satellite radio, you don't really listen to a lot of terrestrial radio or people that are just Spotify, Apple Music people. Like, I try to listen to everything just so I kind of don't get kind of pigeonholed and think, oh, well, this is a hit when nobody had ever even heard it. So at that point, we went on the Bobby Bones show. He played it, and I guess the song kind of resonated with his family. I guess his mother was an alcoholic, and kind of struck a nerve with him. So he promoted it, had us on there to play it live, and then kept playing it on his show, the recorded version of it. So Curb Records came along and wanted to work the single at country radio. They got on board and kind of fumbled the whole thing. I mean, it was weird timing wise. Like, it was on the chart, but then it had fallen off, and then they were going to help get it back on the chart and see if they could work it, and it didn't. But as far as just like the different kind of peaks and valleys of our careers, like, we had Runaway, lost the record deal, got another record deal, recorded a few songs. They didn't want to put those out. Then we recorded Angel Eyes, wanted to release that as a single. That did really, really well for us. Then the next few songs didn't do anything. And then Whiskey on My Breath kind of came along, and it kind of saved a lot of things career-wise for us and kind of put us back on the map more in like a...
Would you say that was after, like, if there was a rock bottom for you guys and for you as a partners in a band, that was coming out of that rock bottom?
Yeah, I would say that was probably coming out of the lowest point of our career up until that point.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been sober for, it'll be 10 years in April.
Oh.
Yeah, but I wasn't even a writer on the song. Stephen wrote it with Trent Tomlinson, Tyler Reeve, Russell Dickerson, Adam Craig, and I think one other guy. And they were all up at a writer's retreat at Stephen's family cabin on Kentucky Lake. And I was supposed to be there, but something happened family-wise where I couldn't go that weekend. And I remember the morning after they wrote it, he texted me. He was like, hey, someone's going to cut this, but I think I can convince them to let us do it. And I was like, well, you're a writer on it. It was kind of our writers' camp to try to write for us, so I think we've got a good shot. And, so we ended up recording it. People think that he sings the whole thing because he sings lead on the verses, but I sing lead on the choruses and like the breakdown section too. So, and I guess like when you hear a song without really seeing a video or seeing it performed live, we sing harmonies the whole time. We literally just switch back and forth the whole time. So there's no real way for anyone, unless they're like really keen on what our voices sound like. I mean, but I think that song kind of pulled us out of like a weird place. And for me, it was actually a big part of me getting sober because we were up there playing it every night. And my mom had been, battling alcoholism at the same time I had, and my dad was going through some stuff with my mom, and he'd kind of come to me and like asked me for some help and some advice and like kind of what I thought about the situation and if I saw her as being an alcoholic or not. And I was so in my own world and I was so wrapped up in my own addiction that I couldn't really even see what was going on in my parents' relationship. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, my dad needs me at this point for me to even just be like a good sounding board for him, or for him to like bounce questions off of and, ask for my advice if he needed it. I didn't feel like I was in a place to give that advice because I was battling my own addiction. I don't think many people even really realized it because I wasn't an angry drunk. I wasn't wasn't necessarily like a fighter. Like if someone wanted to fight me and I was drunk, I would absolutely, throw down in a second. But, I didn't really have like, I don't know, by, most people's standards, like a serious problem. But I also didn't understand addiction. I didn't understand recovery. And once I got into it, I was like, oh, man, like started to have some liver issues and some other stuff. And I thought, well, just as long as I can keep the social aspect of it together and not, be sloppy and be falling all over the place, getting put in jail all the time, like as long as I'm not doing that, I can keep it together. And I realized that I was just digging myself a deeper and deeper hole. And I wanted to be a resource for my dad. I wanted to be able to look at my mom and be like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this to your marriage? Why are you doing this to your kids, your grandkids, et cetera, et cetera? And to be honest, that was like one morning I woke up and was like, I'm not going to drink anymore. And I made it like probably 6 months the first time. And then something happened career-wise that, I don't know if we got dropped or a song didn't do something. And I like fell off the wagon hard and just, started, drinking whatever brown liquor I could find, a couple cases of beer a night, just whatever I could, just kind of to numb everything and just make me feel better about, what was going on. And I realized I had some, childhood trauma, some other stuff that, not necessarily like being abused or anything like that, but just, things that were abnormal and relational things that, were very, very unhealthy. And I I think once I stopped drinking, I was able to kind of rationalize with myself and quit making excuses. I mean, my biggest excuse was to my wife in particular. I mean, she had told me, she was like, if you don't stop, like one day you're going to come home and we're just going to be gone. And for me, like that scared me, and I needed to get a lot of things figured out, you know, so I could be a good dad, so I could be a good husband, and ultimately to be a good partner in my band with Stephan. And but what I was getting at is, like, in this business, you're told, like, by these radio guys, well, if you're not going to drink with me, if you're not going to do a shot with me, you're not going to drink this $500 bottle of wine, like, you must think you're better than me. Or it was kind of like a stigma that I had kind of created to defend my own drinking. And, you know, everything in the business is associated and, you know, kind of revolves around alcohol.
Yeah, largely. And where are you playing, you know?
Yeah, exactly. You're playing, and in the business, it's a lot of hurry up and wait. You show up at a venue, and then you have, especially if you're on a major tour, you get there 8 o'clock in the morning, you don't play till 7 o'clock at night, you play for 30, 45 minutes, and then you're done for the rest of the night. So,
and there's alcohol everywhere.
Everywhere. And whether it's, you know, the main band and you having a couple drinks before they go on stage, or whether it's a radio guy that wants to do shots on the bus, like, there's always an excuse to drink, and there's always going to be the opportunity. So it was almost like the perfect scenario for me to justify my addiction and my habit, which maybe that helped create it, but then it also justified, you know, kind of being stuck in it. And I think once I realized, like, A, nobody really gives a shit. B, everyone else is struggling with their own issues. I'm not the only one. And I don't know, once I basically took everyone else out of the equation and looked at it on my own, I was like, are you even happy? And I realized I wasn't. I was miserable. I was self-medicating and trying to cope with alcohol instead of facing the actual issues that I needed to face. And, you know, the big thing for me was always, you know, insecurity. And, like, I guess it was a form of imposter syndrome. I guess it still is. Like, just thinking that, man, how did I luck into this gig? And how did I, like, maybe it's because that's what I wanted to do my whole life. I always wanted to play music. And I always looked at everyone else around me. Oh, they're a better musician. They're a better producer. They're a better writer. And I think that came from growing up in the church and being a people pleaser and needing to keep people in relationships, you know, kind of copacetic, just to make sure my parents were happy and that they weren't, you know, people weren't looking down on them or looking at them kind of with the side eye because their kids act in a certain way. And I think I felt a lot of responsibility, unwarranted responsibility.
That often
to try
happens to pastors' kids.
Yeah, to be someone that I wasn't, because I needed to, you know, be a good reflection of my parents. And
you feel like
one
you
of
have
my
to
parents
be
in
perfect.
particular, and one of my parents, I mean, my mom being a preacher's kid also, basically made me think, well, I had the perfect upbringing. My mom, like, my dad was a pastor, we did this, we got to go on amazing trips, like, but then I realized they were kind of almost like, my grandfather was a pastor of a really big church in New Jersey. He was friends with Billy Graham. Like, he spoke at, like, you know, big Christian conventions and stuff. And, like, even my dad, when he married her, he was like, man, when I told my parents I was marrying Bill Knutson's daughter, they were, like, over the moon. They're like, oh, he's a celebrity in the church world. So he almost thought that he had, like, a trophy wife in the sense that, oh, the woman I married made my parents happy. So his goal was then to keep her happy at all costs, you know, for the rest of her life. And I think he finally realized how unhealthy that was, and they ended up getting divorced. And Mom actually drank herself to death this past February. And even for me, looking back on myself, my own sobriety, at first I got sober to try to save my mom and to try to save my mom and dad's relationship. And then when I realized that wasn't necessarily going to work, I was like, well, why did I do this? And then when I relapsed and then went into Vanderbilt's Behavioral Health Center, which is basically prison. And I think being in there and seeing what my life could turn into. And I mean, I met some of the most incredible people while I was in there, but I mean, there's dudes, you know, strung out on heroin, meth, all kinds of stuff in there. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm better than these guys. I don't have that kind of problem. But I was very close to being that deep into my own addiction and probably trying to dabble, you know, in pills and other hard drugs and not necessarily just alcohol. So I don't know. I guess looking back on it, I'm incredibly grateful for the the things that have happened, and even my mom's death. I mean, it's an awful, awful thing, but it also made me realize that I can only control myself. I can't change my mom. I can't change my dad. I can't change Stephen. I can't change record executives. I can't change band members' opinions about anything. Like, really, the only thing I control is myself and how I approach things, how I think about things. And I think since I've adopted that mentality, a lot of the other issues and the things that used to give me incredible anxiety and things that would make me depressed have kind of faded away, just because I realized I'm putting so many eggs in this basket of, other people's approval, and they probably don't give two shits about what I'm doing, what I'm thinking. And sure, maybe someone's going to comment on social media if I put out a song that they, for whatever reason, don't like. But like, in the grand scheme of things, how does that actually affect me? It doesn't. It only affects me if I let it. And I think approaching just life, my career, and parenting, being a decent spouse, I think taking that mentality into it and being thankful and grateful for what I do have, not looking what everyone else has or wondering and worrying about what everyone else thinks about what I'm doing or what I'm wearing or the car I drive. It's just you spin your wheels and you never get yourself anywhere. And I feel so much more fulfilled now that I'm trying not to let those people's feelings and opinions dictate, how I feel and how I act on any given day.
Yeah. Do you know who Mel Robbins is?
Mm-mm.
You might. She's this blonde lady, wears black glasses. She's kind of like a self-help person,
Okay.
but she just came out with a book called Let Them. And it's exactly what you just said. Like, you can't control other people.
Yeah.
Like, if they want to do it, let them. And then her answer to it is let me. Like, what can I do for me? And what am I in control of for me? But let them. And I thought that was cool. And that's exactly what you just said.
No, it's really cool. And I think that there's so much to be said for that.
And I'm just learning that myself because I'm an empath by nature.
Yeah.
And I just want to fix everything for everybody.
Yeah.
And so it's really a relief when you can say, I don't have to fix that person. I don't have to control this and that and hold on to all these things because it is very anxiety inducing.
It is.
Did you struggle with anxiety through your career not that you're not in your career, but I mean, is that something that was a vein in your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. Like, when all the stuff started happening with my mom and dad, and her alcoholism kind of started rearing its head.
And when was it? How long ago was that?
That was probably 8 or 9 years ago.
Okay.
Maybe close to 10 now that started. And I think it was 9 or 10 years ago. I don't know. There's been different weird things that have happened.
That's all good.
Kind of relationally, but I don't know. I just lost my train of thought. I don't know where I was going with that.
No, it's all good. I was just curious if the anxiety stuff was something you dealt with.
And I mean, I had never personally dealt with anxiety at all. I didn't think I had. And when my mom and dad started going through their stuff, my dad just was telling me, he's like, I have this paralyzing anxiety. Literally, I just sit there and I ruminate and I think and I think and I think. And it's and he was obsessing over how he could fix it and what he could do differently, how he could be a better husband, how he could, not bring up certain things that would trigger my mom or whatever. And that was the first kind of real experience I had had with any type of anxiety. It wasn't really talked about a lot on the internet. It wasn't really a thing. Now you talk about everyone's anxious now. And I think there's a certain level of anxiety that's healthy, and that the way my dad was describing what he was feeling was similar to kind of how I would feel before I would go on stage, in a sense, those nervous type feelings. Mm-hmm. And where he got was to this place where he felt like it doesn't matter what I can do. He didn't feel like he necessarily had control, which he really didn't, because he was trying to change someone that did not want to be changed, and he was trying to change someone that thought that he needed to be changed. And there was no real discussion. There was no openness about what it is that either of them could do as partners in the relationship. It was, oh, you need to be more like my dad. You need to be more like this guy. You need to do this. I want to feel free to do what I want to do. And like, I think he just realized like there was nothing he could say or do that was going to change my mom's opinion of him or how she felt about drinking. She loved the fact that I drank as much as I did because she almost had
to justify it.
Yeah, exactly. She had a partner in crime. Like when she would come out to Nashville, it was like, oh, it's an excuse to go drink with my kids.
Yeah.
And I was just like, okay, well, my mom was letting loose a little bit, having a little bit more wine than she would normally have. And then I realized, oh, she does this at home too, and then just tells us and him that, well, no, it's just a little bit more because I'm with my kids. So I think he realized the thing, like his control was slipping away from him, and that made him very anxious because he grew up in an era where marriage was everything. Divorce was like
especially in the church.
In the church,
man.
oh yeah, like you couldn't serve in any capacity in the church if you were a divorcee or if you know. There was infidelity or anything like that. And like, I mean, there was just a stigma against it. And I think his entire identity was found in his marriage. And I realized my entire identity was found in my career, and not necessarily just in having a career, but in being very successful and having certain things happen in my career. And if they didn't happen in the way that I thought that they should happen, I looked at it as kind of, you know, a strike against me that I'm not delivering or I'm not doing what it is that I need to. And it was something that I had very little control over. And I noticed that was making me super anxious, just not having control. And I guess up until that point, I had kind of crafted, you know, in my mind what control really looked like and what security, whether that be financial or career, really looked like. And I think I put all my eggs into that basket, and I lost sight of everything else that actually mattered. And so I wouldn't even say that I'm still like an anxious person or I ever even struggled with anxiety, but I think I just struggled with not being able to push the pieces and create the outcome that I wanted every time. And for a lot of my life, I had been able to do that. And, you know, whether it's your circle of friends, the people that are in the business closest to you, like, I don't know,
So what happens?
I think we've had a lot of yes people in our career with us. So,
oh, that's interesting. How has that affected you?
I think that it gave me a false sense of security in the sense that the whole first part of our career, everyone was telling us everything that we did, every song that we wrote, everything that we turned in was just great and we could do no wrong. And then all of a sudden, when we weren't necessarily the thing that was being pushed, it was, oh, well, now these songs aren't good enough. And I'm thinking to myself, well, they're better than the ones that you used to tell me were awesome. Like, I couldn't figure it out. And then I realized a lot of them were just telling us what we wanted to hear because they wanted us to be what they wanted us to be. They didn't want us to do different things creatively. They didn't want us to be outside of the box or do things that kind of push the envelope. So they were telling us like, hey, this kind of cookie cutter stuff that you're writing with all of these big songwriters and stuff, that's what we want to hear. And nothing really ever changed. Like we kept writing with those same people, and it was just all of a sudden we weren't the shiny toy in the toolbox or the shiny tool in the toolbox.
Do you feel like Nashville turned its back on you? Music Row turned its back on you?
I mean, it feels like that in a sense, but now looking back on it, I don't think they did at all. I mean, it is like I remember we were managed by Ken Levitan, and Ross Schilling was our day-to-day manager. And he's basically we went over to Scott McGee and Doc McGee after that as management, just because we thought you had to have a big manager to make it work in business. And I remember seeing an email from Ross to Scott, and he basically was like, "I don't know what else to do with them. I've tried everything." And I remember like that stinging a little bit, thinking, oh, well, our manager's turning his back on us. So like, why is the label going to be interested in this stuff? But he wasn't. I mean, at that point, there weren't a lot of different types of strategies or things like to get new music out there. It was very formulaic, and it was a process, and it was a machine, and they put you into the machine, and what came out the other end was what came out the other end. And it worked a lot of the time, and then sometimes it didn't. And I think Nashville on the creative and the business side, or on the business side, not so much the creative side, has a very short memory. And it doesn't matter, like I was getting at earlier, talking about the relationships that you used to absolutely have to have in order to be successful. You don't necessarily have to have those same relationships anymore. And it was hard to kind of reconcile and like figure out, okay, well, which relationships were real, which were people that were just kissing our ass to, you know, get what it is that they wanted out of us, or have access to another artist that happened to be on the same tour. there was always an angle that someone was working, it seemed like. And I think once I realized that, it became easier to navigate the business because it is an incredibly corrupt business, just like every business.
Yeah.
And there are good people in the business and there are bad people in the business. And I think if you surround yourself with people that are just going to tell you what you want to hear, you'll have some success. And then I think that'll fall off really, really quickly. But I think having people that are honest with you, and when you turn in a song and it's just not that good, instead of being worried about hurting your feelings, like, well, tell me if it sucks. Like, don't tell me it's good just because you don't think my ego is going to be able to handle it. And I think we're at a place career-wise now where we've talked about the highs and the lows. I mean, success-wise, I'd say we're probably at the lowest point that we've been in our career. I mean, we've made a couple records independently and put those out, and we've realized, like, oh, hell, you don't have a $100,000 marketing budget. It's really hard to make any waves. And if you're not willing to spend a lot of money on the content side and the social media side, you're kind of dead in the water also. I mean, I listened to your podcast with Craig, and, we've been in the business about the same amount of time, and kind of contemporaries come up in the business together.
Kanan, too.
And Kanan as well, yeah. I mean, Stephen moved to town with Kanan.
Oh, wow.
Kanan was one of the songwriters on our first single, Runaway. And, yeah, he's another perfect example. Like, just guys that have now kind of reinvented themselves and adopted the new social media game, and they've made careers for themselves without the airplay on the radio. And I think Stephen and I, to be honest, need to be better about just embracing that side of it. And I think,
but it's also tragic to me, because when you're spending more time looking at a cell phone to make content, and Kanan said it really well when I interviewed him. He's like, I'm an artist. I'm a songwriter. I'm not a content creator.
Yeah.
He didn't sign up to be a content creator and be posting every day on TikTok. Yeah. And then so he won't do it because of that's what is his, his mental, emotional boundary for him to keep him in a creative space.
Yeah.
And artistically, it's just not what he wants to do.
Right.
And he's saying, no, I'm not going to do it. Flip side is it's really hard to have the career without that.
Right.
But there's the part of me that's like applaud to him, because I'm like, you're doing music because you love it, and you're not trying to play the game. And everyone's over here trying to play the game.
Right.
But even the people playing the game, even if they get a record deal, doesn't mean a whole lot.
Yeah.
And so you just said something that I want to circle back to. You said probably career-wise we're at a low. How do you feel about that? Like saying that?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's funny that you asked that, because like Stephen and I are obviously very different people, but also very similar. Like, we have a lot of the same beliefs. We, handle a lot of things the same way. But then, like, I feel like I'm more open and comfortable with saying, like, yeah, we're probably at the toughest point of our career and the lowest point. But I'm also personally at probably, like, emotionally and just as far as my happiness level goes, I'm at a level I've never been at. And I think it's because
in a good
way, yeah. Like, and I think it's because I've realized how little control I have over what I guess culturally we define as success. And I think I've realized that I've been incredibly blessed to have incredible opportunities. I've had incredible success by the world standards, but then now on the spiritual side of things, I feel like I've learned so much about myself through all of the ups and downs, through the emotional ups and downs, through the family turmoil and everything. It's like, again, I wouldn't trade any of it for the world, because those experiences have shaped me into who I am. And like we said earlier, it's like you have to fail to succeed, and you also have to fail to appreciate the success. And if you're just, going balls to the wall from the beginning and you never had anything bad happen to you, it's like, all right, well, then when the shoe finally drops and some shit does happen, like, that's going to be demoralizing. It'll crush your entire world. Like,
that's your whole identity.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's important. I mean, I love something I've heard on Joe Rogan multiple times. It's like, he goes, the guys that I know that are truly the most successful and that I look at as being the most successful have been through absolute hell, whether it's family, career, friendships, like they've been through it and they've come through it stronger. And the reason they are the leaders that they are is because they've experienced loss. They've experienced pain in a way that most people never have. But the difference is they don't sit there and, wallow in self-pity. They pick themselves up by their bootstraps and they learn from it and they become better because of it. And I think as artists, as human beings, we have the choice. We get to choose how we react to things. We get to choose how we let other people, affect us.
Yeah,
so,
where are you at spiritually?
I don't know. That's a weird question. I mean, growing up in the church, I felt like I was very much in this box. And I guess when I talk to people about it these days, I just call it the organized religion box. And I think organized religion is really good for a lot of people. But I also think it constrains you. I think it shelters you. And I think I don't know, I was thinking about this in the shower this morning, actually, because someone asked me, like, something about my childhood, and my mom was a nurse. My dad was obviously a music minister, so we would take these trips to Romania every year, and the women would work in the orphanages, and, like, the men and teenage guys would go work at this camp in the mountains. And, like, growing up in church, I remember being taught, like, all right, Jesus died on the cross for your sins. There's only one God. It's this one. And if you don't believe in him, you're going to hell. So we go over to Romania, and it's like our goal is to, convert as many people as we possibly can to Christianity. And it was almost like to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And we would go over there, and these people were incredibly selfless. They had just come out of communism. They had been through absolute hell. And they were some of the happiest, just grateful and content people I had ever met. And I learned so much from them. I would come home from every mission trip thinking, well, what the hell was I over there for? Like, they ministered to me, not the other way around. And even talking to my dad about it now, like, we both kind of have the same approach and the same thought process when we look at it. It's like what we were doing was more of just scratching our own ego and feeding ourselves. And I think that's in large part like what the modern day church is.
I see it. Yeah.
I'm not like poo-pooing on the church or Christianity or anything, but I just think it's very backwards. And I think there's so much legalism and there's so many rules, and the church is so quick to destroy people for being sinful. And, I think it turns people off to what God really is.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you look in the Bible, I mean, God used imperfect people to do his perfect work all throughout. And I would say the majority of Christians are modern day Pharisees and very heretical. And I mean,
I've had that.
I don't know. I think it's very legalistic. And I don't think that is in any way like what God is all about. And and not like a question I had as a kid was like, okay, like our church also sent mission groups and mission trips to like the jungles of Ecuador, and they would go find these, tribes of Indians that had never even had outside contact with any other, civilized being. And like our goal was to go send these Christian, ministers in there to convert these people so they wouldn't spend their entire life in hell or their eternity in hell. And like, yeah, that all sounds good in theory, but it made me think like, okay, well, the God we serve and that is as loving as like we're taught in the Bible, and as like, why would he create these beings that are in a jungle somewhere that he knows will never have contact from like, big city boys from Chicago or something that want to come down there and give their brand of Christianity? Like, are those people really going to go spend eternity in hell and suffer for all of eternity because we didn't make it down there to minister to them? Like, it just made me think like, okay, maybe there isn't just one box that we should all fit inside of. I mean, all right, so I understand why.
Very open-ended theological, because I've thought about that myself. Yeah. But also there's like not a concrete answer to it, There's a lot of ambiguity to certain things. And I do understand, because like I grew up in the church, and I grew up playing music in church and stuff, similar to you. My church probably wasn't as strict as yours, though. What kind of
we
church?
were PCA, Presbyterian. So.
Okay, yeah, you're way different than ours. But all that to say, I worked at a church, and I see the, like, hey, we donated this much money to this local organization, and here's a video about it.
Yeah.
And it's like they wrote them a $10,000 check, but the church's annual budget is millions, you know?
Right.
And I like to go back to, for me personally, the Bible. And what you said struck a chord with me, because like Jesus hung out, like his homies were fishermen. They weren't qualified. And the people he hung out with were not, like, it wasn't it wasn't the people that were all popular and cool.
Right.
It was hookers and tax collectors, thieves.
Yeah.
And he was always like, it's not the well and healthy that need a doctor, it's the sick that need a doctor. And I think that so often we can take a faith and turn it, like the imperfect people of the church that have done a terrible job of representing the character of God. I think I see this in society, and I feel like for me, so often I just want to be like, on behalf of the church, like, hey, sorry everybody, you know, like, very imperfect people have done a pretty bad job of a lot of things over here, and have made Christianity look one way, when if you actually read the Bible and looked at who Jesus was, which is what I like to do, is quite different, the person that he was. But I realized for me in my journey, and I'm curious about you for your journey, that through your struggles, do you feel like, because you did say, I realized I can only control me. Mm-hmm. For me, I realized I lost my mom, and that was like September 2 years ago. And then I lost my dad 3 days ago.
Oh, man. Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, dude. And it was crazy, man. And for me, I don't know, like, I have this feeling of knowing that I'm going to see them again, you know? And my dad at the end of his life was like tripping, and he was saying like, I'm a sinner, like, dude, am I good enough? Like, am I going to make it to heaven? And like, it was an interesting thing to witness that at the end of his life, mind you, he had a concussion, and he wasn't like mentally super all there. But he was like tripping about it, and I was like, yeah, Dad, you're good. But the spiritual growth that I've had in myself through these trials and tribulations, they are the things that have grown me. Yeah. And they're also the things that have deepened my faith in realizing that, like, wow, I'm out of control of a lot of things. Yeah. I believe God is ultimately in control. That's my belief. But do you feel like for you, because you had mentioned spirituality a couple times, do you feel like you subscribe to the belief that there's a God that's in control or not? I'm just curious. Yeah. There's no wrong or right answer.
Yeah, and like, I think when I bring up spirituality in certain circles, like, people are like, oh, so you're not a Christian. Like,
yeah, and this doesn't even need to be in the podcast, by the way.
No, I would love for it to be honest. Okay. But I 100% believe that there is a God that created everything and that is in control of everything.
And you have a relationship with God, you feel like?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's also part of my issue kind of with the modern day church, is that when people talk about astrology, when people talk about spirituality, when people talk about other things that aren't necessarily praised in the modern day church, that they're subscribing to some kind of weird pseudoscience. But for me, God created everything. God is the source of everything. So God created the sun, the moon, the stars. He created everything. And I believe that when we look at God, when we look at our Creator, like, we shouldn't just be in this, whether it's a Southern Baptist or evangelical free, like, denomination to where, like, I don't know, like back to those Indian tribes that are in the jungles of Ecuador or the Amazon, like, they're looking at the sun as giving life to plants, to them, to helping grow the food that they're eating, like, and if they don't have a greater understanding of spirituality, of spiritual beings, of the creation story as we've been told, like, they obviously have to come up with something on their own. So there's something that's very raw and organic and real about what these people are believing in and what they're worshiping. I do believe, like, I don't think they're worshiping a false God, because if they're worshiping the sun, God created the sun, and maybe they don't have an understanding about the creator that actually created that, but they understand, oh, this gives life to everything. Water gives life to everything. Like, yeah. I mean, I think there's those ideas and thoughts are poo-pooed all over by, these thinkers and think tanks, and it's almost like, I feel like, to distract us from community and being amongst other like-minded people. It's like, oh no, you're not PCA. Like, even the divisions that are within the church,
it's political.
100%.
Yeah, man.
And I hate that, because I feel like my relationship with God, and even what I was taught my entire upbringing in church, and I feel like I just have a better understanding now that I've kind of looked outside of the box that I had been expected to stay inside of, and I have a greater appreciation for the church, for the people within the church. But then I also see these assholes that are in the church that basically hide behind their religion just to be assholes to everyone for the sake of being assholes. Like, and they think they're better than everyone else because, oh, well, I go to church every Sunday, I go to youth group on Wednesdays, take my kids to something with the church on Saturday mornings. Yeah. It's like,
it's all acts based.
It's all very works based.
Works. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Which is very much like Catholicism, in the sense that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to get into heaven. Like, I don't believe that's how it works. I think at the end of the day, it really just comes down to good versus evil. Yeah. And I think our gut, our intuition tells all of us what's right or wrong. Even if you're so far one way or the other, like, I don't think your gut's going to lie to you. Like, you have a feeling when something is wrong and you choose to do it anyway. And I think you have the opposite good feeling when you're in the right and you're doing something that is uplifting and it's going to encourage other people. Like, I mean, the writing is on the wall, and it's always been. Like, I mean, and I think so many people have used religion to do horrible, horrible things, and they've used it to do incredible things also. And I think there's always going to be two sides of the coin, the people that are going to do good and the people that are going to do evil. And I think both have to exist, because there has to be balance. And I think everything is about balance. And I mean, when you talk about that with like life coaches and other stuff, it's like, well, no, it's not always all about balance. But I mean, positive and negative in electricity and in everything, there's a positive and a negative, a yin and a yang. It just is. And I think the more people that will kind of break outside of that box and the legalism and the rules, and I think it will help us on a huge level as far as society goes. And just, I think we need to get back to the point where we're all about people instead of all about politics and identity politics. And I think, I mean, say what you want about politics in this day and age, but like, I mean, I'd say it's probably more divided than it's ever been. It is trickling down into every aspect of everybody's lives. And
yeah, it's two.
And I think it's by design.
It's two tribes. It feels like it's by design. And if everyone would stop watching the news and get off their phones, like, to me, the person at Starbucks that I'm talking to in line, I don't know what they believe. I don't know what their faith is, what their political beliefs are, but we're driving, and like, there's the human aspect of it. Yeah. And there's not a wall that is dividing us. There's no division there. Yeah. And I believe that if we focus more on that, like, that's one thing I would love to see. Yeah. Because I do see that division. And it's interesting, back to faith, the greatest commandment in the Bible is love God, and then it says love your neighbor as yourself. And to me, it's pretty simple. And if we could subscribe to that, it would go a long way.
Yeah.
And sometimes we overcomplicate things. And a thing I found, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I'm curious because you said you're the happiest you've ever been, even though on paper you might not be having as many spins on songs or whatever. But in terms of being where you're at, just like mentally, physically, spiritually, it sounds like from what you're saying, you're in a good spot because you've grown so much through the hard.
Yeah.
And the hard has produced the man that you are now.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's the storms that make a good sailor.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like sailboats or boats, they're not made. I mean, they're safest in harbor.
Yeah.
But they're built for storms.
Right.
And I feel like you said it so well that you don't regret any of that. And I don't regret any of my journey, even though I've lost my parents and as of recently as 3 days ago, because I know it's going to produce in me the man that I'm supposed to be. And then that man is the man that I feel like God has intended for me to be. And I'm just like kind of resonating with, what you're saying about that. Yeah. Do you feel like having kids made a huge impact?
100%. Yeah, when I had my first son in 2013, like we were kind of right on the heels of Angel Eyes, doing really well. So we were on the road like 150, 200 days minimum, really a year. Like, I mean, I think one year we did 235 shows. Like, I think it was 2013 or 14. So I felt like I missed out a lot on like the first few years of his life, just because I felt like I have to be on the road, I have to ride this wave, and I have to make the most of it. And to be honest, I regret it because I missed out on some of the coolest parts of his life. And then we had our second in 2019, and then got to pretty much spend 2 years at home with him during and pre and post COVID, and got to experience all the things that I missed with the first one. So I was incredibly grateful for that opportunity, but it kind of made me rethink like some of my priorities moving forward. Just the idea of working smarter, not harder, not just being gone for the sake of being gone, because that made me feel like I was being productive. Because I think it was hurting, the relationships at home. I was missing out on stuff. I'm sure my wife resented me for being gone and not being there to help with, the exhausting, newborn stage.
Oh,
I mean, even as a husband or a father, there's not a ton that you can do, but just being there for whatever it was that I did need to do, and I wasn't. So I regret that. And yeah, I think it changes everything, because now all of a sudden you have two little humans that rely on you for literally everything. And I mean, it's not a whole lot different than being on the road, like especially if you don't have a good tour manager or an active tour manager and you handle a lot of that stuff yourself. It's like you're wrangling a bunch of people and trying to just keep everybody happy. And I think maybe some of that helped me as a parent, just being able to, juggle a lot of different things at once. But yeah, it kind of changed. It changed how I wrote music. It changed everything, because you have these two little sponges that are soaking up everything that it is you're doing. And like, I was an alcoholic for the first few years of my one son's life, and it was like I was drunk around him all the time. Like, and there's part of me that thinks, all right, well, what if I was still drinking that much and he saw that version of me all the time? That's not necessarily who I was all the time, but if I was home, it was an excuse to be drunk, and I would try to get drunk whenever I was home. And I don't know if I could have even been a halfway decent father if I had been doing that throughout. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of people that can, but at the same time, like, I would challenge any parent to like, hey, get as sober as you can for your kids, just because I promise you, you're not going to remember a lot of the amazing shit that happens. You're not going to remember, certain birthdays that you use as an excuse to get drunk at your kid's second birthday. You know what I mean? Like, you're gonna regret a lot of that. And I think kids are so much more intelligent and intuitive than we give them credit for, and they pick up on that, and they will carry those same bad habits with them into adulthood. And one thing I've talked about recently with my dad, and I had talked about with my mom, was like, you guys had no clue what you were doing, but us as kids thought that you had it all figured out, and your parents didn't have any clue what they were doing, and you thought that they did have it figured out. And I think a lot of times we pass down, like, I don't know, generational trauma to our children because
generational curses or chains. Yeah, I believe
because
in
we
that.
think that well, my parents raised me this way. I turned out fine, so I'm going to do it the same way. And I think that fucks a lot of people up, and it's a shame in my opinion because it doesn't have to be that way. And it's like, okay, let's take the good from our parents and then recognize the bad and be like, okay, we are not going to do that. And you know, parents will come to their kids and be like, well, I raised you. I did this. This is how you should be doing it. And most kids don't push back because traditionally, you know, you respect authority, respect your elders, and they know better. But I've learned that they really don't. And they were guessing just as much as us. And some people figure it out. Some people don't. And I think it's just important that, I don't know, we look at our kids and look at them as being the next generation, as being the future, and not letting our egos get in the way when we're trying to raise them and impose like our will on them. And I think that can be, you know, taken into music or into other business, into every walk of or every aspect of life. I think trying to take our egos out of it and just doing what's best for the heart and what's best for people, I think is far more important. And something I've been working on, and every single day I realize how hard it is just because it's hard not to be selfish and egocentric. I mean, that's how we're designed to be. And I think, you know, people throw around the word narcissism and cluster B personality disorders and stuff more than they ever have. And everything is just an excuse. Like, oh, well, he's that way because he's a narcissist, or he's this, that, and the other. Like, well, we all have ego, and a healthy amount of ego is a good thing. Just when it gets out of balance, I mean, and then people become labeled as disordered, that's when we have an issue with it. And instead of actually helping those people and giving them tools to work through it, we slap an SSRI on them, we give them an anti-anxiety medicine to basically turn them into a zombie. And then those same things still manifest themselves in different ways. It might not necessarily be through speech, maybe through actions, it may be covert manipulation. I mean, it's crazy how smart the human brain really is. And like, I figured out so many different like coping mechanisms and stuff that I've developed that I was completely unaware of. And it's literally your brain and your central nervous system protecting itself. I mean, so we put ourselves in these awful situations and then we expect kids to just turn out fine. Like, no, figure it out. Like, well, no, we got to give them the tools to figure it out. And we have to
It's
guide
extreme
people.
Ownership.
Yeah.
Did you read that book ever by Jocko Willink? He wrote a book called Extreme Ownership. I highly recommend it. But it's basically something you said earlier was taking ownership. Like at the time, was it the label's fault? Was it their fault or whatever? Or should I look at myself?
And if you ask me and Steven, we would probably give you two completely different answers.
Yeah,
but
probably.
Like, we're both at very different places in our walk and our journey and our spiritual life. And
that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just because I believe something doesn't mean he has to believe it. And that's another thing. Like once I got onto this path, it was like I was on the warpath in the sense that I needed everyone to believe what I believed. But that was just a new incarnation of that same way that I had always been. Yeah. And once I realized, like, no, I can't force that on anyone else. If someone asks me a question, I can share my story. I can share why I believe what I believe. But the things that have happened to me in the last 3 years are completely different than the things that have happened to Stephen in the past 3 years, the things that have happened to my wife, to my dad. Like, everybody's dealing with a massive amount of shit. And that trauma and that burden affects every single person differently. And I can't expect what works for me to work for everyone else. Like, I'm 10 years sober. I'm in recovery. I work the 12 steps. I go to a couple AA meetings a week. But at the same time, I realize that doesn't work for everybody. I have a couple of friends that are trying to get sober right now, and they're like, man, it just feels too much like church. It feels like this, that, and the other. And I'm not going to be the guy that just sits there and says, no, you have to do it. You have to do it because it's going to fix you. Because I don't believe that that's what fixes you. I believe having an understanding of your own psyche and why you are the way you are is the best way to navigate those situations. And again, there's not a blanket fix, but I think society wants a blanket fix. Everybody's on social media, on Instagram, on TikTok, looking for the next thing that's going to revolutionize their health, their life, their health, routine, their emotions, anything else. Like, oh, if I drink this mushroom drink, it's going to make me a genius. Like everyone's looking for something, and companies are making millions off of it. But I think, like, some of these people that are deplatformed or demonetized, they're the ones that are usually speaking the most truth, and it's generally go inward, go inside yourself. Like,
you mentioned Rogan.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I always have been. I mean, back since like when he was on like Fear Factor. I don't know. Just always, there's something like very just charismatic about him, and I've always appreciated the way that he looks at things that he may, on the surface, completely disagree with, but he's always willing to hear everybody's opinion and give everything like a fair shake. And
that's what I like about it.
That's what I appreciate about anybody in that space that is willing to listen to, you know, fringe things that make a whole hell of a lot more sense than like what we've been taught in school. And
you
what
called
science
the LA
teaches us.
fires, or you had a firefighter on that talked about what was going to happen if the Santa Ana winds had shifted in the wrong direction. And sure enough, it's just interesting how a lot of that stuff's happened and how he was hated so much for not doing what was the protocol at the time. And then now everyone's like, oh, he was right.
Yeah. Well, I remember that. Like, I've used ivermectin for years just because back in the day I realized that they used it for head lice, which was a parasite.
Yeah.
And then I'd read that there was, you know, they basically treat every type of worm, parasitic, bacterial infection in any animal with ivermectin. Once I realized they wanted, you know, Pulitzers and other stuff for whatever it's won. I mean, it's pretty crazy when I saw them like basically demonize him, and you know, saw the memes with the horse face and all that stuff. I mean, it didn't fit the narrative. It was hard for them to make money off of, and it wasn't remdesivir, which is a patent I guess it was owned by Fauci and the NIH. So like,
and look who's the biggest podcaster in the world.
Yeah,
because he told the truth and was just honest in himself.
And I think people recognize that. And
that goes back to music, man. Yeah. What would you tell, where do you want to see yourself 10 years from now?
That's a good question. I don't know. I know selfishly where I'd like to see myself in 10 years. But when I look back at the last 10 years, if in 2015 you told me that the things that had happened to me in the last 10 years would happen by 2025, I would have told you you're full of shit and there's no way. So I don't know. I don't want to like box myself in, or I don't know. To be honest, I just hope that in the next 10 years I continue to grow and learn hard lessons. Like about 3 years ago, I started praying. I've always been big into meditation and prayer, and I started praying for God to just grow me and make me stronger and turn me into the best version of myself possible. And I selfishly asked for that, thinking I was going to have chart success. I was going to have records that went number one as a producer, as a writer, that I was going to be X, Y, and Z. And that's what I was expecting. That's what I asked for. And I feel like God has done that, but he's done that through 10 years of some of the hardest shit that I've ever had to go through in my life. And like we've both said, I wouldn't trade any of it for anything. Like, I don't think there's a single instance where you'd say, well, if you could change this and then, you know, have had a number one instead of top 20 with that, would you have? Like, honestly, I don't think I would, looking back on it now, because I don't think that I was capable of, like I said, being an even halfway decent steward of the responsibility that comes with that type of success and that type of, you know, financial freedom. And I feel like now that I've struggled for 10 years, that I've had those ups and those downs, like I needed that. I needed some horrible things to happen in my personal life to help me realize what kind of ego I did have and how selfish I truly was, and how I was focused on having success at any cost. And I don't know, I've had a conversation with somebody recently and they were like, well, you can take two paths to success. There are the people that will beg, borrow, steal, cheat, step over people, kill people on their way up. And sure, they're successful, but what do they have to show for that for all of eternity? Are they going to be held to account for, you know, the lives they ruined on the way up? And I don't want that responsibility. Like, I want to do it in the most upright, godly, I guess is the word, but just in a way
like
that's
what God's will is for
right.
you.
Not necessarily like the church definition of God and like being that pompous, like churchy person,
pompous,
but
I'm
like
saying like
what matters to people. Like that's
yeah.
like
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, man. Because I'm that way too, where I'm kind of like living life with open hands like this. Because I realized, like you did, by being humbled, you can't control the outcome.
Yeah. And I think it requires like painful, traumatic things happening because, you know, losing a job or having something bad happen, getting in a car wreck, like, as long as there's not like serious physical damage, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's bad things that happen, but I mean, like they're all over the place, but there's certain things like losing a parent, like losing a spouse, stuff like that I think really, really can do some serious damage if you don't really dive into it. And I think you have to sit in that pain. You have to feel the pain. And I think the society we live in, it's all these quick fixes to get rid of pain. And
yeah, they want to do steps of grief. Like there's the first step. And I got this book. It's like basically throw all that out the window. Yeah. It says there's no steps to grief.
And it's different for every person.
Yeah, grief is different for everybody. And you might grieve the rest of your life and it's going to look different. Yeah. But that person's always going to be part of you and who you are. 100%. And you're going to love them and you grieve because you loved. Yeah. And it's okay to grieve. Like sometimes I'll be like fine like we are right now. And other times just randomly I'll just freaking break down. Yeah. You know, and that's grief and it's okay. Yeah.
And I think society has kind of put labels on, oh, if you grieve this way as a man, you're a pussy, and if you're this way, you're a stoic, and that's how you should be. And like, it's so dangerous. It's irresponsible, in my opinion, because different people, men and women, like, we're all different. Everybody is so different. Yeah. We're all the same, but we are all so different. And I think everybody grieves differently. Everybody handles loss differently. Everybody handles success and failure differently. And I don't think there's, like we've talked about, there's no blanket fix for making anyone feel better. And, you know, some people go really inward and dark and they want to listen to really dark, depressing music that makes them kind of ruminate and feel what they're feeling. And then other people want to escape and listen to something happy, watch a, you know, crazy movie or something that just distracts them. And I think I would prefer to be the more introspective type and go inward as opposed to ignoring and coping with, you know, the things that the world has given us to cope with. Oh, yeah. And I think more and more people would prefer that way than doing the hard work. And like you said, sitting in the grief and learning how it feels to hurt. Yeah. I mean, I think it's the most important thing to be at the bottom and to be able to claw yourself out of that. Because if you haven't been there, then how do you know what it feels like to be on the opposite end of it? And how can you ever truly experience it if you haven't experienced both extremes? Yeah. And I think too many people just ignore the extremes and they just want that comfortable place to exist in the middle. They want the comfort or they want to numb the pain. Yeah. They want to numb it, man. And so that's just my life. And that's your life story, man. Like you've really opened up and shared a lot about what your journey's been like. Yeah. And I appreciate that. What would your advice be to your younger self? I kind of like to end things this way sometimes, just depending on how the convo goes. But if you could go back and you could talk to Eric Gunderson before the first big hit, what would the 40-year-old version tell that kid? I think I would tell myself in every situation, no matter what, trust your gut. Because some of my biggest regrets, career-wise, relationship-wise, are not listening to my gut, my intuition, and listening to what someone else thinks that I should do. And me not having the confidence to trust myself and to allow that trust to bring about the best possible outcome. I think so many times I gave too much credit to people that had been in the business longer or they had a title that gave them some type of authority over me. And I think, my biggest advice to myself would be not to listen to those people. I mean, obviously take what they say and internalize it and massage it and try to figure out why it is that they might want me to make the decision that they're kind of trying to force me to make. But I think every time in my life that I've trusted my gut and followed my intuition, it's worked out in the best possible way. Not necessarily the way I wanted it to work out, but in the way that it was supposed to work out. And I think I lied to myself a lot. I lied to other people a lot. And if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would give you a completely different answer. And back then I would lie and say, yeah, I'm confident in my decision. I'm making this decision for me. But I wasn't. I was making the decision for everyone else around me. And I think with selfish ambitions, thinking that maybe this will bring about financial freedom sooner, or we'll have more chart success sooner if I do this, when there were things that just straight up felt wrong. And I didn't stand up for myself and what I believed in. I don't think any of us did, in the band at least. And I think the more...
Would that be your advice to artists now as well, young artists?
I think so. I'd say trust yourself and trust your creative vision, because that's what got you to the point where people are even recognizing it in the first place. And I think so many people are so hungry for that fame, whatever being famous means even anymore. They just want that notoriety. They want people... They want to feel like what they're doing matters, and however they need to achieve that, they're willing to do it. And I think a lot of people, like I said, will step on people, step over people to get to the top. And then those are the same people that are going to be there when you're on your way back down, and they don't forget that shit. I mean, they don't. And at the end of the day, I think it is just more important to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And I think what you put out there into the world, you get back. And I think, not necessarily believe in karma, but I believe in a version of it. And I believe that positive energy is met with positive energy, and I think negative, evil crap will bring you a lot of shit. So.
Yeah. Dude, that's a great answer, man. I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming on and just opening up about life.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, dude, and just being able to chat about life stuff, dude, because it's cool to hear people's stories.
Yeah.
And we're all kind of figuring out this thing together, you know?
Yeah.
And you said my dad's is different than mine, which is different than my wife's. But at the end of all of that, I think back to our earlier thing, it was like the love factor.
Yeah.
Because if we all just love each other, that's really what I think we all need.
Yeah.
And that's
Why do we do anything? Because
Yeah.
we want to be loved.
Yeah.
We do. Like, and we want, whether that love is different to a lot of different people also.
Yeah.
But I think on a fundamental core level, love is more powerful than anything.
Yeah.
And I think having community, like-minded people, I mean, that's one thing I do love about church. It's, a lot of like-minded people. When you're having a good worship service, like, you feel that spiritual energy, and that exists. And I think that feeds the soul. And I think that's something that we need. And it's one thing I love about AA is the community. It's one thing I love about the gym I go to is the community and the people. Mm. And I've realized as I get older, it's all about people. And like some people look at me and they'll be like, well, you're kind of introverted in the sense that, like, after a show, like, you'll go back to the hotel room, you don't really want to hang out. I'm like, hey, it's because there's a lot of drinking, and that's still an issue for me, to be around from time to time. But I don't know, like, I sense like those rowdy, ruckus, like, drunk fests it's like they're almost like they steal that positive energy because everybody's being brought down by it. And you think, oh, as I lose my inhibition, I'm actually feeling it and I'm better, but you're really not. It's a depressant. Like you're not doing something good for your body. You're actually putting poison into it. So, I mean, for me personally, it's like I want to seek out people in an environment where that is fed and not where I feel like my energy is being leached out of me. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that, makes me an asshole. Before I probably would have been like, well, yeah, I'm getting kind of a dick just by not hanging out. But it's like I make my own boundaries. I get to decide what is good and what's healthy for me. And if somebody else doesn't like that, there's a chance that they just feel guilty about the fact that they're doing it themselves and they don't have the ability to kind of withdraw and pull them out of that negative leech-like situation. But there's also people that just don't understand it. And, I have to be free to do what it is that I need to do for me. And I think maintaining those boundaries, I think, is incredibly healthy. I mean, even going back to family, it's like just because you're blood, that doesn't mean that you have to like put up with all the familial crap. Like,
just because you were a friend with someone doesn't mean that you have to still be their friend.
Yeah.
Because you outgrow people. We outgrow people. And just because you're related to someone doesn't mean you have to hang out with them.
Yeah.
And I think you said that well. And I think often we don't understand that boundary, or we're not familiar with boundaries as a whole.
Yeah.
We outgrow people, and that's human nature. You want to be around people that are life-giving, not leeching.
100%.
I think it's important for people to understand that if they have those relationships, they can distance themselves.
Yeah.
You're not married to someone. And my psychiatrist, right, but I had to make this later because I was talking to him, and it was perfect timing because of what happened with my dad on Monday. But he said, I think what he said was, let me look. I think it was having grace for yourself. And it's something that we really suck at as people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of us put other people, but he said, be gracious. I'll read it in first person. Be gracious with myself, meaning no matter how much I feel like I'm falling apart, give myself grace to grieve. Don't think you have to have the same experience as you've had before. Be gracious. It was gracious with myself. And I thought that was really cool, and it just stuck out. I knew it was a G word.
Yeah.
But gracious, man. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the grace that we're afforded by God is incredible.
Yeah.
And I think if we can give ourselves that and give other people that, we're giving people an incredible gift, and we're giving ourselves an incredible gift by being able to be gracious in those moments.
Yeah.
And like we've said earlier, I think we're designed to feel. We're designed to be emotional beings. And I think the modern day social construct kind of preys on that.
It does.
And it forces us to kind of get into one side or the other, and we can't truly be complete individuals, and we can't be whole because we're kind of parting ourselves out for all these different things to even keep different parts of our own psyche happy. And I think it's really dangerous. And I think that's one thing I am truly appreciative of this kind of new spiritual awakening that you seem to be having more. It seems more prevalent than it has ever been right now to me, at least. And even that's being psyoped in the sense that they're trying to take that over and I think force people into one side or the other. And I think they're trying to demonize people that are taking a more spiritual approach to things.
For sure.
And again, like that might be labeled in the next couple of years as just absolutely off the wall and cuckoo. Like, and who knows? But I think we, again, just have to be true to ourselves and what we feel is right. And I think if you are truly honest with yourself and you truly trust your gut and your intuition, you will never go wrong, I don't think. But I think there's so many people that now try to justify something that they've read on Instagram or in a meme as that being their, I don't know, their real self. Like, I just don't think people actually want to look in the mirror and see how flawed and imperfect we actually are. And like that's one reason I love mushrooms, like because I feel like when people talk about a bad mushroom trip, I don't think it's a bad trip. I think it's an uncomfortable realization of who you are. And the deeper I get into it, I've had multiple like led shamanic kind of journeys and stuff. And the most effective, I think, are the ones I've done by myself in a dark room, blindfolded with earplugs in, and where you're forced to just be with yourself and see the good, the bad, the ugly, the uncomfortable. It forces you, when you come out of it, you're like, God, that was awful. That sucked. But then you're like, man, I feel like I just figured out a whole lot of shit about myself that I wasn't aware of before. And even
because you're rewiring neural pathways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think neurogenesis is something that people completely ignore. And I don't know, there's a reason why it's on a schedule and it's illegal. It's like, people start realizing these things have incredible medicinal benefits. And
for PTSD.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've spoken at a couple military conventions now on the benefits of treating PTSD with psilocybin. And I had a line of 60 people afterwards just to talk to me, like, how can I get some of this stuff? And you have to be very careful about it just because, A, it's illegal, and B, there's a stigma associated with it. So even what we're doing with our educational content for that stuff is like you have to be very careful about what words you use so you don't get deplatformed or demonetized and stuff. But I mean, I think most people that are seeking out that information are doing it for the right reasons.
And if Andrew Huberman's talking about it and people like that, and there's legitimate scientific studies with control groups that are huge, which there are, then you know that there's something there. I mean, and it's being legalized slowly in different pockets all around the country. I believe the study was done starting in Oregon. There was a big one there. That's a whole nother conversation.
Oregon,
dude.
Utah, Denver.
I could talk to you all day on that stuff because I'm really interested in neuroplasticity.
Some wild stuff.
It is very wild. But thank you, man, for being on here. I appreciate it. And we didn't get super deep into where you're at music, but it was more about the person, and that's what I wanted.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, dude. But for people that want to maybe just get in touch with you, or obviously Love and Theft is the band, but where should they go if they wanted to reach out or whatever, follow you,
I guess for me personally, like my Instagram is probably my main thing. It's the Gunderson, and obviously our band page also, Love and Theft, and I'm on Facebook and Instagram mainly. So we got some new music coming out hopefully at the end of January, maybe February, depending on the content we need to shoot for it. But we got a few songs in the pipeline ready to come out.
Cool.
Hopefully have a new project done by the end of the year that we can release all at the same time.
That's awesome.
We're going to try to, do something a little different this time with the release because we've kind of done it the same way for everything. So just going to try to be nimble and kind of adapt to where the business is at and see if we can do something cool.
Yeah, so that's exciting. So new music on the horizon.
New music on the horizon. And
I mean, we're halfway through January already. So
it's crazy. It's already flying by.
Yeah, man. So. Well, that's cool. So The Gunderson.
The Gunderson on Instagram, and my email's gunderson.eric. So if you want to get in touch with me and send me anything, feel free to do so.
Gunderson.eric
at me.com.
At what?
Me. M-E. It used to be like cool. iCloud when it was Mobile Exchange when they first started that.
Okay. And Gunderson spelled?
Gunderson.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Eric, man. I appreciate it. It was good
Pleasure.
It was good to hang.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
And that's a wrap on today's episode with Eric Gunderson from Love and Theft. Again, if you're interested in following him, go to The Gunderson on Instagram or just Google Love and Theft. They were really the soundtrack to a lot of my younger life, and it was cool to sit down and just have a great convo with him. And what he said at the end there, I hope you caught it, because he said he'd go back and he'd talk to his younger self and say trust his gut, and he also said he wouldn't change anything in terms of the hard times because of what it produces in you. So if you're going through a hard time right now, you need someone to talk to, DM me at Stephan Hogan on Instagram and YouTube. We will see you very soon, and thank you for tuning in. Have a great week. Peace.
This is the Stephan Hogan Podcast.